Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this our CAWASA Wednesday webinar on the 29th day of October 2025. This afternoon, all of us perhaps sending commiserations to our friends and colleagues in Jamaica who are reeling after the passage of one of the worst storm events in the Caribbean region. Hurricane Melissa, which was a Cat 5 hurricane. And of course, our teams are mobilizing through our various partner groupings under the TDIMA umbrella to give support in the assessment, response, and recovery effort in Jamaica. So we're just keeping them in our thoughts and in our actions as well. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Ryan D. Phillip, who is the Special Project Development Officer at the Caribbean Climate Change Center in Belize, and who I think we met during the conference, the CWWA conference held in Belize, in San Pedro, Belize last week. So welcome, Mr. Phillip, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much, Mr. Jane. Yeah, it is quite ironic that I think I delivered the same presentation around the same time last week at the CWWA conference. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share it again with colleagues that have joined. I wouldn't give too much of a background about myself, but as Mr. Jean said, I am Ryan Phillip. I'm a project development specialist at the 5Cs, where I primarily work on structuring proposals to access climate finance from a number of donors, particularly multilateral climate finance donors such as the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. And we also work with a few multilateral development banks such as the World Bank, etc. But before joining the 5Cs, I would have worked as an engineer at the St. Kitts Water Services Department. So I have a very strong understanding of the water sector in the Caribbean. I have a strong understanding of some of the challenges that utilities face. And that really is what drove me to put together this presentation and deliver it last week at the CWWA conference. So in a nutshell, like I said, I understand some of the challenges at the utility level. And what I found is that the persons who are typically in charge of designing and delivering internally funded projects, capital projects, they have many roles. And I know this very well. When I worked as an engineer, I was in charge of capital projects. We were also in charge of operations, etc. And sometimes the project development process gets lost on us. So what I'm going to present today is just a very simple framework that I think can help to guide utility workers and managers. And the focus is on structuring projects to achieve maximum impact or achieve the greatest value for money, perhaps. So why I think this matters, again, is that working at the utility level, I realized that the demands are vast and they're continuously growing. Every day, every year, utilities are, the tasks and the demands increase. But what doesn't increase is the available resources. And that doesn't just mean available financial resources, but also technical resources and capacity, which haven't kept pace with the expectations of, a modern utility. So in order for these utilities to sustain that progress, I believe that it is important for every investment to deliver measurable outcomes, to deliver maximum impact. And I set the scene last week at the conference with this image, which presents what is called the bridge to nowhere. So it was well intentioned, very well designed, but again, missing in terms of the impact. And unfortunately, I have come to witness projects like this in the region. We've built tanks, we've upgraded treatment plants, but what does that mean in terms of impact, in terms of service reliability, improvements in water quality, etc.? It's very difficult for us to highlight that and measure it. And the reason for that, or the reason that I have seen, is that we have a very strong focus on completion of projects, and we have a very strong focus as well on tracking outputs. So for example, we would typically look at the number of tanks that are constructed. We would track the kilometers of pipeline that were replaced. We would look at the number of treatment plants that we would have commissioned. And additionally, we would look at the budget that has been spent. And really, this is rooted in projects being designed and implemented without defining what success would look like before or in the conceptualization of that project. And sometimes we happen to stumble upon improved impact. Sometimes we stumble upon success, but we definitely need to change that mindset. So what I'm going to focus on is highlighting outcomes instead of outputs. And I have here on the right side of the table a few examples of that. So instead of looking at tanks constructed, we look at tangible improvements in water service reliability, so an improvement from 12 to 18 hours per day. We look at the percentage decrease in non-revenue water from 48 to 32%, an increase in water quality compliance from 85 to 98%, and a decrease in operation and maintenance costs, and a decrease in energy costs. So these are some ways in which we can start framing impact at the end of a project, but it is important for us to consider these things when we're designing the project, because the only way you would be able to track these outcomes is if you have a baseline before the project is implemented, when you're going through the design phase. And one of the things that I highlighted as well is the large percentage of unspent budgets. And the focus for this is on internally funded projects. Working at the utility level, I would have seen that at the end of the year, let's say we were given $5 million and we would have only expended $3 million for a number of reasons. But what I believe the main reason to be is, poorly defined logic within the project. When we're conceptualizing those issues, it's not always the case that we don't have the capacity in terms of the technical resources, in terms of the financial resources, but sometimes the logic within the project is missing, and it's something that can be built in to those projects when they're being conceptualized. So the shift in thinking, or the paradigm shift, as some people would say, is that we start thinking about projects, we start thinking about activities at the utility level as being impact oriented instead of implementation centric. So instead of thinking about how many tanks we would have constructed, we look at tangible outcomes that would improve service reliability and quality for the consumers. So to do so, I would have presented or prepared a three-tiered system, a continuous system for smarter projects. The first tier is screening, which would confirm the logic and readiness before you design a project. So really, we're going to think about, does this project actually make sense? Tier 2 is designing the project, doing the detail engineering designs, making sure that all your boxes are ticked, ensuring that you have ownership of the land, etc. And I really believe that throughout the Caribbean, we do this stage very well. We're very good at engineering practices, building, construction management, etc. But I've included it as a tier. And then the third tier as well is learning, which is going to allow us to track and evaluate based on the outcomes of previous projects. And the guiding question there is, what did we learn and how do we improve? So today, though, I would really like, and the focus at the CWWA conference as well was on stage one, or tier one, which was the screening. As I said, I think it's important for us to have a certain logical sequencing when developing or conceptualizing projects to ensure that what we're addressing is a verified problem and we do have the resources to track impact. So I've created 4 stages in the screening tool. Stage 1 is readiness and viability. So the core question there is there a verified problem or opportunity worth solving? The second stage is results clarity, which is what specific measurable outcomes are expected. So right there, right then we're defining success before we even start fully designing or pouring resources into the project. The third tier is feasibility and sustainability. Can this realistically be delivered and maintained? So we're going to do a very quick check for the technical, financial, and institutional capacity of this project. And then the last part is where I would have put together a project type diagnostic. So really it's going to identify what kind of project this is, and it would distinguish between 4 different forms there, which I will get into a little bit later. So the first stage of this very simple guiding tool, project ideation guide, is the readiness and viability. And what we want to do is confirm that the project addresses a verified, relevant, and high impact need, and that a potential solution pathway exists before allocating resources. And I think this is very important for a number of reasons, because, going back to the point that I made earlier, we often have good intentions when we're developing projects or conceptualizing projects, but there isn't this checklist that we can refer to guide us through that process. And at times, because utility managers, etc., are pulled in many directions, certain things get overlooked from the onset. So this provides this very simple guide. The first question is there credible evidence of a service performance or compliance gap? Yes or no. Number 2 is, if no action is taken in the next 12 to 24 months, will reliability, efficiency, or compliance deteriorate or cost rise? So this will look at the urgency of the intervention. The third one is, has at least one feasible intervention or option been tentatively identified? So this is just to make sure that a potential solution pathway exists before we pour resources into this project. And then the final question would be, would addressing this need deliver a material improvement in service quality, efficiency, or resilience? And based on how you score those within the tool, we've proposed a decision logic matrix. So once you say yes to all of those, then you'd be able to proceed to the next stage. If you select yes for all of them, but number 2, which is related to the urgency of the intervention, it would be proposed that you schedule this as a strategic upgrade, as it is not deemed a priority and your resources can be better utilized. If you select all but number 3, it would give you the caution to conditionally proceed, but the solutions are unidentified. So it would ask you to start thinking about what those potential solutions would be. And in the next stage, you're actually going to have an idea of what those solutions would be. So it would allow you to proceed. If it's urgent and impactful, but you don't have concrete evidence to support that there is a problem, if you have been in constant communication with a particular community, etc., and they've said to you, all right, yes, we don't have water from this time to this time, and you cannot verify the source of, the issue, And then it would ask you to clarify that evidence before you move forward. And I think that is important because at times I've worked in the utility and we've had issues in areas. And they said, yeah, you know, we don't have any, our pressure is low, we don't have any water. And really, it wasn't a concrete issue. It was just that a valve was closed or something to that effect. So this one asks you to clarify the evidence. And if you only select two or less, then it would ask you to reassess and go back to the drawing board. So once you get past that initial stage, you're going to check the results clarity. And this is to define the measurable outcomes that demonstrate real improvement in service delivery, efficiency, or resilience. Each project must identify at least one quantifiable outcome with a baseline and end of project target. So as I mentioned before, we're going to start looking at outcomes rather than outputs. So we're not looking at how many lengths of pipe we've replaced. We're not looking at how many tanks we've built, but we're starting to look at how we have improved service delivery and efficiency. These are some proposed outcomes under three different categories. So we have service reliability and access. And the first one is continuity of supply improved. It gives you a unit, hours of service per day, and it guides you as to where you would be able to find that information. And it provides an example of the metric type. So I propose a number of these outcomes, and there are also a few more categories on to 7. These are just preliminary. For utilities interested in using a tool like this, then it would have the flexibility to adjust these outcomes as it deems necessary. And there would also be another tab focus on other improvements. And this is just to give an example of what that would look like. I've put forward a project called the North Coast Reliability and Loss Reduction. And what they're going to do is build out DMAs. They're going to do some actively repair. They're going to do a bit of pressure zone management, etc. And how we could think about that project is now in terms of the outcomes, the improvements in service reliability. So we're going to move from 12 hours to 18 hours. Water quality compliance will increase from 85 to 98%. Non-revenue water from 48 to 32%. We're going to look at the institutional capacity, the number of operators trained and certified from 8 to 20. And the storage capacity would move from 3 days to 5 days. And it then produces the percentage change. And it's important to note that this is before you start doing any engineering designs. This is before you pour any financial resources into the project. We can start identifying what success at the end would look like. And again, I put forward a very simple decision logic matrix. I am still thinking through ways to improve this, but for now, it is that if you have more than 3 outcomes with baselines, then the project is well defined and the impact of the project is well defined. If you have 2 outcomes defined, then it is acceptable, but it would ask you to make it a bit more robust. And the same for 1 outcome, you would be able to proceed, but it also identifies a minimum threshold. I understand that in some projects you could have 1 outcome, but because of the impact that that would have materially for the community, it may be feasible and it may be highly impactful. So I'm also thinking about ways that this can be restructured to account for the percentage increase or the percentage change in terms of the outcome. So once you've moved beyond the second stage, you will now have a very short checklist for the feasibility and sustainability. So we first identified that there is a real urgent problem. The second stage has identified what the impact would be or what success would look like at the end of that project. And now we're going to do a very simple check to make sure that everything that we've put forward thus far is actually feasible. So there are 7 questions. The first is the solution technically appropriate for local conditions and skills? Understanding some of the capacity constraints, etc., that we have. Yes or no? Are materials and expertise locally or regionally available? Working in a utility, I understood how important this was because sometimes it would take a matter of months before we can get materials to move projects forward. Are costs affordable and within available budgets or funding plans? Yes or no? Can operations and maintenance be covered from normal revenue? So in essence, would this be a sustainable intervention? Number 5, does the utility have adequate staff and authority to implement? Number 6 is, are land permits and community approvals feasible within 12 months? And the last one is related to environmental or social objections from the proposed project interventions. So again, a very simple checklist. It doesn't intend to be exhaustive, but what it seeks to achieve is to provide some sort of logical sequencing and consistency in terms of the way that we think through projects. Again, this is from my experience at utility level. We've had we've thought of or conceptualized very impactful projects. In some cases, we might have identified what success looks like, and we've run full speed ahead. And then at the end of the day, we realize that we don't have permission to operate on that land, and that project could be stalled for a number of months based on that preliminary oversight. So this is something that I think would guide the logic in terms of that sequencing. Again, we put forward a very simple matrix. Can be redefined with a little more thought, but for now, it's strong feasibility and readiness if there are 6 or 7 yeses, feasible with 4 or 5 yeses, and if they're less than 3, then it doesn't appear that the project could be feasibly implemented and would need to be revised in terms of the scope. So we've gone through the first 3 stages of this screening tool. They allow the utilities institutions to assess whether there is a verifiable problem. You would identify what success looks like, and now you can also say that it can be realistically delivered and maintained with existing resources. And then the final part is related to the project diagnostic type, and this is to determine whether the project is fixed, adaptive, hybrid, or institutional. And the reason why we want to do or identify the type of project is so that before you move into the design phase, there can be some sort of guidance to align the utility manager with what the most appropriate design and implementation pathway would be, because we understand that most projects are very different in their nature. So again, a very simple checklist: nature of results. There are 3 physical assets, institutional systems, or a mix. The delivery pathway, which would be linear and predictable, or phase/learning based. The success driver, which is engineering precision, operational learning, or behavioral change. And based on how you respond to those questions, the tool would then categorize the project that you are presenting, and it would also give you a brief definition of what type of project it is. So we have fixed infrastructural projects. Those are physical assets with high sunk costs. So if you're building a tank, if you're building a treatment plant or a transmission main, those are interventions that are largely irreversible. But a type B project is an intervention that can be piloted. So if you're rolling out a SCADA system, if you're rolling out a smart metering program, those are things that are reversible. Those are interventions where you can learn as you go through the process. So they're very much adaptive. Type C, we're looking at capacity building and policy reforms, etc. So we're looking at tariff reforms, we're looking at utility restructuring. And then type D is a blend of type A or B. So you may have an intake, or you may have a tank that you're building and you're hoping to integrate that into your SCADA network. So the construction of the tank itself would be type A, it would be fixed. But the integration into your SCADA system can be adaptive, and you can switch and change some of those parts or elements as you move through the project. And the most important part from this stage is the design logic. So for fixed infrastructural projects, you have to ensure that you get your engineering design right. You have to understand that the feasibility is assessed very thoroughly at the initiation. But for an adaptive project, I propose what is called logical incrementation. So you would be able to learn through each phase. You can have a number of phases for a smart meter program, and you allow some time to learn and monitor based on how, what you've implemented has performed. For tariff reforms, etc., you're going to do iterative learning as well. But the process there would focus more on stakeholder engagement and ensuring that you've gotten feedback in terms of how those interventions are implemented. And then type D, you just have a blend of that decision logic. So once you pass this stage, you could proceed to the design. I won't be presenting the design stage today because I just wanted to, well, the first time I presented this was at the CWWA conference. And I just wanted to get a feel from utility operators if this is something that they're interested in, if this is something that we can build on with an existing platform or an existing system. And then if, I wasn't sure if we should roll this out at the utility level or regionally to track outcomes and improvements across utilities. But those were some of the discussions that we would have had then. And in closing, I just want to say, every project begins with logic. It's important for us to start thinking about what success would look like. Before we implement a project, we have to start thinking about outcomes, and we have to start thinking about how we can maximize the value for money, especially for internally funded projects. And I think this would also help when it comes to accessing extra budgetary projects, climate finance projects, etc. If we have this internal capacity to think through the project ideation phase, and it becomes a lot easier to access some of those climate finance and multilateral banks, etc. So with that, I would close. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ryan, Mr. Phillip, sorry, for this presentation. And I'm sure that those of us who were not at the CWWA conference would appreciate, or at least we've been able to bring it to them who were not able to participate in the event and your live presentation. And of course, we'll have it around, and they may be able to reach you. I will just open the floor to anyone who may have questions for you at this stage. Feel free. Meanwhile, I wait. I would ask, uh, Ryan, with some of the, I mean, this is so profound, because many projects, of course, as you quite rightly stated, those many bridges to nowhere, and to think about completion without impact, and to be thinking through the processes. In your experiences, have you found are there some huge gaps in our utilities and maybe following some of that process, and in finding or maybe preparing project for, say, now that many of our utilities are making moves towards the Green Climate Fund, do you believe that if some of that pathway is followed, that it may make it more, well, make it easier for them to access the type of funding?
Sure, thanks for that question. I can only speak to my experience, with the utilities and my experience as well in project development at the 5Cs. At the utility level, certainly I believe some of these steps are missed, especially in the ideation of projects. And I think it's not because we don't want to follow these processes and procedures, but as I said, you wear many hats when you're working with a utility. Um, when I worked with the utility, I would be focused on operations, ensuring that communities had water. If there was a break on, one of the main lines or something to that effect, I would have to mobilize very quickly to address that. But on the other hand, we're also responsible for moving forward and presenting capital projects, etc., to be funded internally by the department or Ministry of Finance or the financial department in some of the other utilities. And what that does is it drives you to go through this process very quickly. And what I found as well is that sometimes these processes or the projects that are presented are quite reactive in that they address short-term needs of the utilities, some of those issues that seem to be more pertinent or important at the time, without actually having a broader view on the long-term strategy and the long-term approach or a more programmatic approach, I might say. And what I've found as well, coming over to if we start following these processes and procedures, if it would be easier to access some of these larger donors. And I would say yes, largely because throughout the project development process, what I've found is that I've worked on a few projects in the water sector. We miss a lot of that baseline information that is needed. And I think it's largely because we aren't looking at the outcomes. We're focused on the outputs. If I go to a utility and I ask them, how many tanks they have in their system at the moment, they would be able to tell me that, very easily. If I ask them how many wells they operate or how many intakes they have within their system, it'd be very easy for them to tell me or give me that information. But what would be a little more difficult is telling me, what is the service reliability or how many hours per day would a community have water? What is the percentage water quality compliance in community A or community B? So when we go to access funds at these larger donors, this is the sort of granularity that they need because we have to present to them the outcomes of the project and we have to provide a baseline, as I would have presented in this framework, for us to be able to track and measure. Because within these projects, a large component is always monitoring, evaluating, and learning. And I believe that this is something that we do at the utility level, but it could certainly be improved. And one of the areas where I think we can improve tremendously is providing or gathering baseline information related to service reliability, etc.
Yeah, very, very, very profound. In fact, I'm sure that this webinar, I think we will have it. Of course, we're recording it, and I think you did share some of your slides previously. So, particularly for our water utility operations personnel and senior management, I think that would be very useful for consideration internally for them. Any other questions, colleagues, or on the call? I
I see
don't.
no questions.
Yes, please, go ahead.
No, no questions. Everything is straightforward so far.
All right, thank you, Natisha. All right. I just have someone just joining. He may have missed it. Yeah, well, there being no further questions, I'm sure I will. If you have any questions, you can always shoot them through us at CAWASA, and we can always reach out to Mr. Phillip at the Five Cs. And we'd like to thank him so much for taking time off. And unfortunately, Valerie Jenkinson, who did make the contact for us as usual, she's on an assignment in St. Kitts and sends apologies she couldn't join us. So we'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Phillip, for joining us and sharing us your valuable time and that very profound and presentation. And I hope maybe sometime in the future we would be able to engage you again. I'm Ignacio Jean, the Executive Director at CAWASA, and we're about to sign off on this our webinar number 18 for 2025. See you next week. Have a good evening, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
sir.
everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.